Welcome everybody after the lunch. I hope you enjoy your lunch. And we are starting the next panel. This is the topic, and the title of the panel is The Impact Today of Nonconformist Culture. And just before I introduce the first speaker, I just wanted to call your attention to the fact how excellent this conference is structured, because we had a topic on legacy, and now we have topic on culture. And what's culture? Among other things, this is a reflection of legacy, sometimes transformed, sometimes deformed. Nevertheless, these two go together. And this is one more proof how well this conference is organized. Our first speaker is Dr. Mark Andryczyk. Obtained his PhD in Ukrainian language and literature at the University of Toronto in 2005. Presently, he teaches Ukrainian literature at the Slavic Department, Columbia University, and is the administrator of the Ukrainian Studies Program at Columbia's Harriman Institute. His monograph, The Intellectual as Hero in 1990s Ukrainian Prose, will be published by the University of Toronto Press in this spring. He is a translator of contemporary Ukrainian literature and a musician who, as Zajac, has recorded 3 studio albums in 1996, 1998, and 2006. Before I let him start, I would like to let you know that one of the participants, Professor Justyna Beinek, was not able to attend the conference, and her place is taken by Piotr Henryk Kosicky, and we thank him very much for being able to do it in the last minute. Marco?
Yes, thank you, Anna. Yes, before I start my talk, also a couple organizational notes. My personal thanks to Piotr for showing up at this last second. This is really very grateful for this, because we didn't want to lack attention to Poland in this conference. So it will be a little bit different than what was to be presented, but hopefully it will elicit some interesting thoughts in you and lead our discussion. And I also want to take this opportunity, it's the first time I've had a chance before a microphone these days, to thank the organizations who helped organize this conference. That is the East Central European Center, the Polish Cultural Institute, especially Yuri Jerzy Onuch, and the Ukrainian Museum, where tonight's concert will be taking place. So, on to my paper. So far at this conference, those who have managed to go to at least some of the panels, you've seen that we've reviewed the dissident movements in the Soviet bloc, and we've looked at how this period is presently being researched by scholars. We've had a account of where documents from this period are found today, what state they're in, and I thought it was really interesting. We actually got to see the documents yesterday in very interesting presentations. And then yesterday, in the last panel, we had the opportunity to listen in on and participate in a discussion between former Ukrainian, Polish, and Russian dissidents. Now, finally, this morning, we were presented with an analysis of the legacy of the ideas and achievements of these dissident movements on the political situations in the respective countries. Now, in establishing the scope of this conference, we also thought that an analysis of the nonconformist culture of the late Soviet period and its impact today would help us to compare these two periods and these three nations. In my presentation today, I will look at the impact of nonconformist late Soviet-era Ukrainian culture on today's cultural activity in Ukraine. Specifically, my talk will focus on literature, while occasionally commenting on music as we see it tied in with literature in these two periods. The purpose of my presentation, which I've titled Underground Over Time, will be to demonstrate what from this Soviet period came to be influential on today's culture in Ukraine, to provide examples of this influence in contemporary Ukrainian culture, and to explain why the influence of that nonconformist culture continues to steer cultural developments in post-Soviet Ukraine. In addition to providing my analysis, I will first offer a brief historical background so that my presentation could be valuable for members of the audience less versed in Ukrainian culture, as is the nature when you focus on three comparative aspects. So bear with me at the beginning. Several sometimes overlapping intellectual groups came to define the post-Stalin era in Ukrainian culture. Among them were those who continued to function as an instrument of the Communist Party, much in the same manner as earlier, while generally enjoying a relatively freer intellectual atmosphere of the thaw. We had dissidents who were politically persecuted for their intellectual activity and criticism of the government, a group that was politically and socially engaged. And we had marginalized intellectuals who formed an unofficial underground culture that was generally apolitical and socially disengaged. And it is this third group that provided the intellectual type with which the post-Soviet Ukrainian intellectual would most closely identify. The underground unofficial cultural scenes that existed in late Soviet Ukraine proved to be very influential on the succeeding generation of Ukrainian intellectuals. Intellectuals from such milieus different from the 60 writers, the Shizdesyatniki, in that they generally were less publicly political than their predecessors and were driven chiefly by an interest in cultural developments in the broader world that had been closed off from the Soviet system. They sought the freedom to create outside the confines of socialist realism and to acknowledge the influence of previously prescribed artistic achievements, both Ukrainian and non-Ukrainian. These artists rejected the cult of the Soviet man and instead stressed individualism in their art. Analogous movements developed in other parts of Soviet Ukraine, Moscow, Leningrad, as we heard yesterday from Anne's presentation, and the Baltics. In Ukraine, intellectuals involved in these movements are sometimes termed the 70-syatniki, the 70s writers. And the centers of their unofficial culture were the cities of Kyiv and Lviv. The Kyiv scene featured several circles of individuals that contributed to alternative culture in the republic's capital. In his article, Alternativa u Kyivi, being alternative in Kyiv or alternative in Kyiv, Oleksa Semenchenko lists Bogdan Zholdak, Les Podервянский, and above all, Volodymyr Dibrova as the leaders of the cultural underground in Kyiv. Earlier, in the second half of the 1960s, a group of poets known as Kyivska Shkola, the Kyiv School, had formed in that city. Consisting of Vasily Holoborodko, Viktor Kordun, Mykola Vorobyov, and Mikhailo Hrigoryev, this group often wrote in free verse as part of a concerted effort to reintroduce that poetic form, which was dismissed by Soviet culture policy as being unartistic and even subversive into Ukrainian literature. And as Kordun himself described it in an essay, the Kyiv school of poetry can be discussed in several aspects. As a purely poetic phenomenon that maintained free creativity as its chief characteristics, as a group of young nonconformists who designated free will in all of its dimensions as their chosen path in life, as an experimental psychological attempt at living in a different manner from other generations, to live as if your life were taking place in a free and independent country, as a brotherhood of creators of poetry who held poetry itself as their main and extraordinary duty. Kyivska Shkola reacted to the Soviet system and its restrictions on free intellectual exchange by means of exclusion, denial, and a hermetic escape into poetry. Lviv also featured several occasionally overlapping underground cultural scenes. The group that would prove to be most influential on subsequent generation of Ukrainian intellectuals was one that included Mykola Ryabchuk, Viktor Morozov, Oleg Lisheha, Roman Kist, Orest Yavorsky, and Grigory Chubai. They would gather in Chubai's basement to read, discuss, and exchange contraband literature, share new poems, songs, paintings, which they had created. In his article, Semenchenko singles out literature's role in Soviet Ukrainian underground culture. Quote, "It should be noted that under the conditions of totalitarianism, the best way to be alternative was through literature, whose creation requires only a pen and paper, and maybe a guitar and some vodka. Chubai and his colleagues did just that. They got all of the above listed elements, and in 1971 they circulated a literary almanac entitled Skrinya, the chest, in samvidav or samizdat format. Actually, it's been republished, and I had a copy of it somewhere. In addition to poetry and prose written by members that I had mentioned, and Chubai's translation of Tadeusz Różewicz's play Funny Old Man, the almanac featured a questionnaire proposed by Roman Kis to members of this brotherhood. The questionnaire, which can be understood as a manifesto of sorts, warns of conformity and uniformity, and is primarily concerned with existential issues and the role of art in society. Vasil Gabor, a contemporary writer who actually was involved in republishing this, he's a publisher as well, he wrote that, quote, in his introduction, "Unlike the 60s writers, any belief in the government had evaporated for the 70s writers, and they consciously objected to totalitarian government-enforced principles in literature and art," end quote. So like their counterparts in Kyiv, these intellectuals were not publicly political. Nonetheless, these men were Soviet outcasts who had been pegged by authorities as being dangerous. They'd been thrown out of higher education system, and they had subsequently worked at menial jobs. Thus, both in Kyiv and in Lviv, underground cultural groups of the 70s featured intellectuals who existed on the fringes of Soviet society, sharing that space and occasionally crossing paths with various other countercultural movements, including a vibrant hippie movement, which one of our colleagues, Bill Reich, who is monitoring the next panel, is publishing a monograph where he covers that extensively. These intellectuals were marginalized by Soviet society to a position of eccentricity. They were not traversing the path that led to advancement in the Soviet world. In society's eyes, they were outsiders, oddballs, and derelicts. And most importantly, they were different. As intellectuals who were Ukrainian, who resisted systematic Russification and identified with a Ukrainian culture that was different than the sanctioned, restricted one of the Soviet world, they were seen as being especially subversive. They were prime candidates for what contemporary writer Oksana Zabushko refers to as, quote, all 9 of Dante's circles, end quote, that the typical Ukrainian intellectual of that era had to pass through. Unlike the 60s writers, many of whose writings debuted in the Khrushchev thaw, relatively less restrictive, at least we thought so, the 70s writers were from the start subjected to the harsh crackdowns of the Brezhnev era, during which the dictates of socialist realism were strictly enforced. With no access to official publications in which they could publish their works, the 70s writers responded by writing for the drawer and receding to an isolated existence, an existence that critic Alexander Hrytsenko describes as, quote, living under the snow. Besides shunning the above-ground Soviet world for these just mentioned reasons, these individuals hid from society due to a fear of repression and a doubt in being able to induce any change in the totalitarian system. Witnessing the persecution suffered by the politically active Shestdesiatniki, 60s writers, only cemented this attitude. According to the late Solomia Pavlichka, their Hermeticism found a philosophical grounding in, quote, Eastern philosophies stressing the autonomy of the individual, of an identity separate from society. However, it is within this underground that these individuals were better able to create a mirror society in which they could coexist and maintain their convictions. Artist studios, cemeteries, and basements substituted for galleries, center squares, and theaters, at which creative works debuted and were critiqued. These underground cultural communities and their activities became legendary among other younger nonconformist intellectuals, who themselves were then drawn into these circles. The result of such communities was a synthesis among individuals who worked in various artistic genres, as I'll show you. Writers, visual artists, musicians. These relationships would prove to be important in the late 80s and early 90s when this culture moved from the underground and entered the public sphere. They would provide a starting point for the next generation of Ukrainian intellectuals known as the Visimdesiatniki, this post-Soviet generation. So now I will provide a few examples of this influence, as I promised, and how it came to be manifested in today's culture. The first is through the artistic genre of sung poetry, one of these hybrid genres I mentioned. It's an important medium through which underground Soviet and post-Soviet culture became connected. Undoubtedly influenced by the sung poetry of Polish bard Czesław Niemen, who would write songs to the poetry of Norwid and to his own words, Lviv musician Viktor Morozov would set music to Ukrainian poems. Through material that ranged from the early poems of Pavlo Tychina to a Vasyl Simonenko poem, to those of Morozov's good friend Oleg Lesheha, and later to those of a younger generation of poets, such as Viktor Neborak, Yuri Androchovich, Ivan Malkovich. Morozov's craft bridged these literary generations, combining them in a presentation of authentic Ukrainian culture, which opposed the compromised false Ukrainian culture erected by the Soviets. And in the past 20 years, Morozov has further extended this bridge by often collaborating with the band Mrtvi Pivin, Dead Rooster, whose members were born just when this was being put together in the early 70s, 1971. Morozov has served as a godfather for today's musicians, and many of his original songs and his arrangements of folk songs from various periods have recently been covered by musical groups such as Picardisca Tertia and Placi-Remi. The latter group, Placi-Remi, is a band that was formed and led by Hrihori Chubai's son, Taras. Taras Chubai, in fact, had been one of the founding members of the Nezhore's Don't Worry cabaret troupe in 1988. Together with, among others, his father's colleagues, Yuri Vinachuk, Viktor Morozov, and others. The popularity of Nezhore skyrocketed as glasnost progressed. Their mix of political and social satire and an unearthing of unknown and previously prohibited Ukrainian cultural achievements in music and in literature fed Ukrainians who were hungry for something new and non- or anti-Soviet in what was a very exciting time of change. Taras Chubai's music has also been very instrumental in unearthing the Soviet underground culture of Lviv, especially the poetry of his father, who passed away in 1982. He has composed, recorded, and performed songs based almost on all of his father's existing poems, and has organized massive concerts in the country's largest halls to showcase his father's poetry. Hricko Chubai's poetry was not published until 1990. It was then republished in a 1998 volume that includes essays by members of both Hricko's Chubai's circle and younger intellectuals on whom Chubai was influential. Kyiv Soviet underground culture was also influential throughout Ukraine in the 1990s and 2000s. In what is an especially vibrant example of grassroots subversive culture becoming a major cultural phenomena, cassette tape recordings of Les Podrevyansky's reading of his own plays, particularly his subversion of Hamlet, were widely circulated by Ukrainian youth in the 1990s, and the plays themselves were published later in the volume Hero of Our Time in 2000. And the lavish CD set then came out, so it wasn't quite that already, but originally on tapes it was quite interesting. The poets of the aforementioned Kyiv school had become legendary among young intellectuals, and later their poetic works became the subject of analysis in literary journals and actually in several dissertations I know now written on this group in Ukraine. Volodymyr Dibrova's works continue to be widely read and discussed in Ukraine's literary circles. His novel Andryczyk Uzviz, Andrew's Way, won the BBC Ukrainian Book Prize for 2007. And his translations of dramas are staged by contemporary Ukrainian leading theater troupes today. Dibrova's relevance in today's Ukrainian culture is further evidenced when the influential literary journal Chetver, edited by 80s writer Yuri Uzdrik, dedicated an issue to him and his writing. One last specific example of the connection made between underground culture of the 60s and 70s and with post-Soviet culture is provided in the novel Vechirny Med, written by 80s writer Konstantin Moskolets. That novel tells the story of several members of Lviv's bohemian scene in the late 80s and early 90s. It's also a reflection of Lviv in Ukraine and how it kind of lost its center as a place for artists in the early 90s. But what's interesting for us here is that the way Moskolets references the poetry of Mykola Rybchuk in the novel. Rybchuk himself was one of the most influential figures engaged with shaping the face of Ukrainian literature in the years surrounding the collapse of the Soviet Union. His apartment in Lviv had been a popular gathering place for younger visual artists and writers in the 70s, and upon moving to Kiev and establishing himself as a literary critic, Repchuk was responsible for the appearance of first publications for several of today's leading writers, including Andryczyk, Moskalets. But it is his poetry, because he also wrote prose, that Moskalets directly references in the 2000 novel. In that novel, the narrative occasionally becomes interrupted by fragments of Repchuk's poems, culled from the 1989 collection Zima u Lvovi, which actually featured poems written much earlier. Oftentimes, these fragments comment on a particular scene that's unfolding in the novel. The poetic fragments serve to add another point of view to the novel and create a sense of the existence of a parallel world. Moskalets' this direct intertextual connection with Repchuk serves to acknowledge the latter's influence on his emergence as a writer. In that sense, he constructs a direct link between the 80s writers and the underground generation that preceded them, the 70s writers. And he finds a support in paralleling their existence, one which continues to locate them mostly on the margins of Ukrainian society. And this is in conclusion. The means of creating and developing a vibrant Ukrainian culture, independent of funding or government support, which was demonstrated by underground Ukrainian culture of the 60s, 70s, and 80s, proved to be quite useful example for cultural leaders in the years since Ukraine achieved independence. The Ukrainian language and culture today, although free of the restrictions imposed on the 60s and 70s writers, continues to exist mainly on the margins of society. The 80ers have managed to create a culture scene that is varied and vibrant and is making a name for Ukraine outside the country. But for the most part, this is not a culture that Ukrainian politicians, oligarchs, media magnates, or even official organs of Ukrainian culture identify with. Thus, they offer no support for this culture, and today's cultural leaders are forced to resort to grassroots tactics and support outside the country, just like their predecessors in the 60s, 70s, 80s had to do, in order to continue advancing a Ukrainian culture that is intellectually and aesthetically rich, and of interest and critical acclaim both inside and outside Ukraine. Maintaining and expanding on connections made with authentic Ukrainian and world culture of the past and present, forming a community with others who exist on the margins of society, and using this common otherness to resist and critique the center are all vital lessons learned by today's cultural leaders from the existence and the achievements of nonconformist Ukrainian culture of the 1960s, 70s, and 80s Soviet Ukraine. Thank you.
Our next speaker is Professor Catharine Nepomnyashchy. She is Anne Whitney Olin Professor and Chair of the Slavic Department at Barnard College and former Director of the Harriman Institute. Her books include Abram Terz and the Poetics of Crime, published by Yale University Press in 1995, Strolls with Pushkin, Yale University Press, 1993, Under the Sky of My Africa, Alexander Pushkin and Blackness, Northwestern, 2006, and Mapping the Feminine, Russian Women and Cultural Difference, Slavica, 2008. She has published extensively on Soviet and post-Soviet literature and popular culture, on Pushkin also, Russian ballet, and the future of regional studies. She is currently working on a book on Nabokov and his enemies, the terms of engagement.
First of all, I'd like to take this opportunity, because I'm not sure there'll be another one, to thank Marko Andryczyk for the extraordinary work he has done in putting together this conference and also giving a great paper. And I also want to thank Peter Redaway for many things, partially because his books have been on my bookshelf since college, and he also helped me set up my conclusion. So I have many, they go over many decades. And I, like Marko, am going to be talking about literature exclusively, although I am very glad that we have been joined in the audience by one of the foremost
Yes.
Oh, I'm sorry.
The
I was afraid that I was going to, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Is that okay?
Now better. Yeah.
Did you hear what I said? I don't want to have to go back through it again. You got me? Okay. I'm very glad that we have been joined in the audience by a speaker from the next panel, one of the foremost nonconformist artists of the Soviet and post-Soviet period, Vitaly Komar. And I hope, Vitaly, that some of the things I have to say about literature might resonate with what you have to say later. Rather unexpectedly, as a matter of fact, it's sheer surprise to me that I am able to take as my point of departure and focus for this paper, breaking news. Earlier this week, the jury for the NOS 1973 project awarded the prize of the same name to Andrei Sinyavsky's Strolls with Pushkin, Прогулки с Pushkinim, which has been described by commentators as a literatury essay, a literary essay. He won the prize over a daunting field of competitors, including Alexander Solzhenitsyn's Gulag Archipelago and Varlam Shalamov's Kolyma Tales. This event, I will contend in my paper, speaks directly to the topic of this panel, the impact today of nonconformist culture. And I'll say, for those of you who are not familiar with Sinyavsky's work, which may be many of you in this audience, I will say a few more words about it later in the paper. Sponsored by the Mikhail Prokhorov Fund, in conjunction, assumedly, with NLO, Novaya Literaturное Обозрение, the publishing enterprise of Prokhorov's sister Irina, NOS, N-O-S, which is perhaps also a sly link at Gogol's nose, is an acronym for Novaya Sloviesnost, which I believe in this context might best be rendered as the new belles lettres. The annual prize, first awarded in 2009, aims, as stated on the Prokhorov Fund website, and I quote, to point out and support new trends in contemporary artistic belles lettres in the Russian language, end quote. This year, the NOS in the prize's title might well be a gesture to nostalgia. For NOS 1973 turns the clock back 38 years, placing in contention works written or first published in 1973. Engaging in a literary game, Literaturная игра, which I take from the website. To quote the Prokhorov Fund again, and I quote, of course, we are talking precisely about a literary game, and not about the selection of a new canon. There are enough hunters for a new canon without us. As in the case of the debates of NOS 2009 and 2010, it is a game into which we hope to draw the public in order in particular to test which versions of the alchemical union of the aesthetic and the social resonate most strongly with today's mindset, with today's experience, both aesthetic and social. It goes without saying that the naked attempt to rewrite history, imagining what a 38-year-old shortlist might look like if it were made up over the barricades separating literature that came out in Soviet editions, in the emigration, and that appeared in the underground, is also a game, end quote. Yet this game at replaying history has a serious point. To use now acknowledged classics as test models for, and I quote, what after all we are seeking in current belles lettres, end quote. And again, what is being sought is equally of aesthetic and social value. Even allowing for a dole of license taken by the compilers of the shortlist for the prize in assigning work specifically to the year 1973, the richness of the yield and the extraordinary conjunction of literary talent is remarkable. With very few exceptions, virtually every major writer of the post-Stalin period is represented in the shortlist, and some of the most indisputably major works. I'm going to give you the highlight, well, I'm going to give you the whole list, actually, I think. Alexander Galich, Generalная репетиция, General Rehearsal, Venedikt Yerafeev, Moskva, Petushki, Vasily Shukshin, Characters, Характери, of course, Andrei Sinyavsky, Прогулки с Pushkinim, Strolls with Pushkin, Людмила Petrushevskaya, уроки музыки, music lessons, Fazil Iskander, Sandro из Чегема, Sandra from Chegem, Sasha Sokolov, Школа для дураков, School for Fools, Alexander Solzhenitsyn, Archipelago Gulag, the Gulag Archipelago, a work by the Braci Strugaci, the Strugaci brothers, which I don't know how it's rendered in English, Picnic na Obocine, a work by Yuri Trifonov, Neterpение, Impatience, Vasily Aksionov, one of my personal favorite works by Aksionov, Zolotaya Nasha Zeleska, My Golden Ironberg, and a work by Yevgeny Haritonov, prose, of course, Varlam Shalomov's Kalima Tales, and also work by Igor Holin, prose. The works by Haritonov and Holin in particular, the makers of the shortlist pointed out, they took a lot of liberties. They were written over the course of a certain amount of time. There's clearly no easy answer as to why the year 1973 produced such a literary bumper crop, especially given the diversity of the writers and the works. From Solzhenitsyn's monumental attempt at literary investigation, the Gulag Archipelago, to Benedikt Yerefiev's avant-garde called classic Moskva Petushki, to Iskander's magical realist Sandro from Chegem, to Nabokov's perhaps in equal parts crotchety, witty, and elegant collection of interviews, Strong Opinions, which somehow got left off my list, but it's there. So Nabokov was there too. In the context of the very useful chronology of the unfolding of dissident activities and crackdowns provided by Jerry Labor yesterday, this richesse would seem to appear counterintuitive. Indeed, it might be argued that the process of cultural constriction, the initiation of which is most generally associated with the Sinyavsky-Daniel trial in 1966 and its aftermath, would seem to have reached something of a head by the early 1970s. The majority of the writers on the NOS 1973 shortlist had been forced into silence and or exile by the year in question. Nabokov, a literary celebrity by that time in the West, was to all intents and purposes a non-person in his homeland in 1973. Yet perhaps it was simply the case that well into the second decade after Khrushchev's secret speech had empowered intellectuals to think of greater freedom, the seeds sown in the wake of Stalin's death had finally had time to come to fruition. The Shestidesiatniki had come of age. At this point, I would like to bring together a number of points that were made by speakers yesterday for consideration and for the context of my future remarks. Anna Protzik expressed concern that referring to dissidents, in her term prisoners of conscience, as nonconformists trivializes their enterprise. On the other hand, Anne Kamaromi flagged the element of playfulness in the dissident text, which she associated largely with Leningrad as opposed to the more serious Moscow. And Pavel Litvinov pointed out that the very term dissident itself had actually originated in the West and was not a self-description. I put these points together here because I think they capture tensions latent and sometimes not so latent, especially after many dissidents found themselves in bitter factional contention in emigration, tensions latent in the dissident movement itself. And I think that the results of the NOS 1973 prize may help us to understand the legacy and impact of the historical interplay between nonconformism and dissidents in Russian literature and culture today. To clarify my point here, let me focus on the NOS 1973 winner for a moment in quotation marks, Strolls with Pushkin, in the context both of other works on the short list and of the history of its own genesis and reception. And here, one little digression, I would like to note that in this regard that I happened to be staying for the past 2 weeks before this conference in the Sinyavsky house in Fontenay-aux-Roses outside of Paris, where that other legendarily outspoken figure of the dissident movement, who has yet to be mentioned by name at this conference, Sinyavsky's widow, Maria Rosanova, still presides writing her memoirs, which is something for Ben Nathans and all of us to look forward to when they appear. And I am therefore pleased to be able to cite a number of her anecdotes in what follows. I've already written a lot about the scandals attendant on the reception of Strolls with Pushkin, first in the emigre community in the West when it appeared in 1973 in Russian, and then among the Russophile camp of the Soviet Writers' Union when it, or actually only a small fragment, 4 pages of it, appeared in the journal Oktyabr in 1990 during Glasnost. As a matter of fact, to bring a little Russian Institute and Columbia history in here, I first met Sinyavsky downstairs in this building in 1978 when he gave a lecture to a crammed auditorium. I think there were at least 300 people there, all waiting for a scandal from Abraham Terz, and who in fact showed up but the staid professor Andrei Sinyavsky, who gave a very, very solid scholarly lecture on why the memoirs of the Archpriest Avakum more properly belong to modern Russian literature than to old Russian literature. So it was an interesting, the question period afterwards was somewhat more lively because Strolls with Pushkin and a number of other things came up. But I don't know how many of you in the audience may remember this, there was a woman of, shall we say, a certain age who was picketing back and forth between the main gates of Columbia with a sign that said, Stid is Sram, Comrade Avram. Shame to you, Comrade Abram. Which was apparently a protest against Strolls with Pushkin. So there's some Columbia history here. As far as the scandals go, I will merely remind you that readers as diverse as the first wave emigre Roman Good, the dissident writer Georgy Vladimov, the conservative Pushkinist Catharine Nepomnyashchy, who is no relative of mine no matter what you've heard, and the Russophile dissident Igor Yasafarevich found the provocative metaphors out of which the fabric of Strolls with Pushkin is woven, metaphors like Pushkin ran into high poetry on thin erotic legs and created a sensation, or emptiness is Pushkin's content, or that really, really, really controversial comparison of Pushkin with a vampire. They found these metaphors to be at best ill-considered, and at worst, dangerous Russophobic attacks on Pushkin as an icon of Russian culture. For those of you who do not know the work, first of all, rush right out and buy it and read it. But I would also say that it is a dazzling text made up completely of metaphor after metaphor, which I have been told by a number of younger generation Russians reconciled them to Pushkin after he had been deadened for them by the Soviet and post-Soviet school curriculum. Perhaps more to my point here, Alexander Solzhenitsyn, in what was at the time his only literary critical essay, which took its title from a Pushkin text, devoted solely to an analysis of Strolls with Pushkin, recognized the talent of the work, but found its emptiness, its lack of a clear religious and or philosophical point of great concern. More disturbingly, Solzhenitsyn, who was at that time writing in emigration, ended his article on Strolls with Pushkin by, in essence, calling for censorship, because he felt that writers like Sinyavsky had taken the freedom of speech given to them by emigration in the West they had been irresponsible in their use of this freedom and had placed Russian culture in jeopardy. For me, this is indeed the point where playful, in quotation marks, nonconformism and serious, in quotation marks, dissidents part ways. In order to pursue this point further, this rift between what I would term the two tendencies in Russian cultural resistance, let me point out that Sinyavsky himself was always uncomfortable with the term dissident. Are you coming to me? I'm sorry, I'm having trouble.
Okay.
Okay, are you having trouble hearing me, or am I too loud? Oh, I'm sorry. Okay, I'm very sorry. Okay, well, you can have the text later. Okay. I'm usually not hard to hear, but is this better? Oh, sorry. Okay, I can do that more easily. Okay, I was trying not to drown you out. Okay, in order to pursue this point further, this rift between what I would term the two tendencies in Russian cultural resistance, let me point out that Sinyavsky himself was always uncomfortable with the term dissident. He always insisted that he had what were essentially стилистические разногласия with the Soviet regime, stylistic disagreements with the Soviet regime. Moreover, to my mind, his most eloquent statement in this regard came during his closing speech at his 1966 trial. Referring to his wonderful story Pence about an alien who, by an accident of space and history, finds himself trapped in a human body in the Soviet Union and forced to hide his true identity, Sinyavsky said, and I quote, and again, this is from the closing speech at his trial, "In my unpublished story, Pence, there is a sentence that I consider autobiographical. You think that if I am simply different, другой, you must immediately curse me. So there it is. I am different, другой. But I do not regard myself as an enemy, and my works are not hostile works." It was mentioned at some point in the last 2 days in this conference that Sinyavsky was tried for political writings. But the fantastic fictions that constituted the basis of the charges for which Sinyavsky was sent into hard labor are only political on their most superficial level. More upsetting and perhaps threatening to the Soviet authorities, I believe, was the fact that Sinyavsky's Terz works elude classification as much as they eluded the control of censors, that they broke stylistic rules and were playful in that sense. In this context, it seems that the fact that the KGB and Sinyavsky's French publisher misconstrued the nature of Strolls with Pushkin in exactly the same way, and, moreover, made the same mistake as did the censors at Dubrovlag, the hard labor camp where Sinyavsky was incarcerated while he was writing Strolls in letters to his wife, is very telling. Maria Rosanova has many times over many years contended with some glee that she brokered her family's release from the USSR by threatening the KGB with the fact that Sinyavsky had written a work while in the camps, and that the manuscript of the work was already in the West, waiting to be published if anything were to happen to him. Of course, you can imagine what a KGB official would have imagined the contents of a work written in a labor camp to be. By the same token, once Sinyavsky was in the West, his French publisher scooped up Strolls with Pushkin apparently on the same assumption, that he was acquiring a juicy, potentially best-selling labor camp expose. According to Rosanova, the publisher was quite distraught when he actually read the book after signing the contract. Because, of course, for those of you who've read it, you know there is really nothing about being in a labor camp in the book whatsoever. It is all about Pushkin. According to Rosanova, on the other hand, when I once asked Andrei Donatovich, Sinyavsky, why it was that the camp censors did not get suspicious that he was writing so much about Pushkin in his letters to his wife, he responded that all they cared about was that he was not complaining about the food or the other rigors of camp life. How could they have known that Sinyavsky was writing out in letters what would be one of the most scandalous works of his time period? And for those of you who don't remember the scandals, I will simply mention the fact that he actually was compared to Salman Rushdie, and those who did that actually were siding with the Ayatollah Khomeini and suggesting that the death threats against Salman Rushdie should perhaps also be leveled against Sinyavsky for writing this work. That was much later. In other words, Sinyavsky Terz
outplayed the authorities at their own game by simply rewriting the rules, precisely in a spirit of play, but play of a very serious sort. Yesterday, Ben Nathans showed us a document from Siniavsky's KGB file in which there is evidence of sophisticated technical analysis of the typewriter used to produce the Terz works. For those of you who have read Terz's extraordinary autobiographical, in quotes, novel, in quotes, and I noticed that Ben left it off his list of memoirs, rightly, Good Night, might have recognized a resonance with Siniavsky's portrayal of the cat and mouse game detective plot, in which the criminals, Siniavsky and Rosanova, are the good guys, in that novel. A section of the novel in which he satirizes precisely the search for Abraham Terz's true identity by seeking the characteristics of the criminal's typewriter, which keys, could you find the actual identity of the perpetrator by seeing the peculiarities of the typewriter in which the works were typed. As is made clear in that work, Siniavsky's and Rozanova's strategy to elude the authorities may have been a game, or at least they saw it as a game. Just as playful, the playful text of Strolls with Pushkin aimed to liberate Pushkin from the deadening conformity of conventional Soviet Pushkin studies, which supported Pushkin to ideological aims. But these games, again, were serious. They were games, so to speak, to the death. Siniavsky knew that the game of Abraham's Herz would end in the labor camps. And for those of you who did not know him or did not know this, Siniavsky honestly did not believe that he would survive his sentence. Let me repeat, this play was serious indeed. So back to the present. We first learned, we, meaning those of us who were gathered, including Yuli Daniel's stepson, in Paris last week, that Strolls with Pushkin was on the short list for Nos 1973 from an article whose author assumed that the prize would be taken by one of the elephants in the short list, that is Solzhenitsyn's Gulag Archipelago or Shalamov's Kalima Tales. That is, the serious works. And I must admit that we all, including Siniavsky's own writer's son, who himself has earned quite a reputation as a writer in French, were all inclined to agree. So when the word came through on Wednesday morning, so you can tell how long I've had to write this paper, that Strolls with Pushkin had won, it was something of a shock and a vindication. Now, in the interest of full disclosure, I should note at this point that it was not a clear win. In fact, there were 4 winners. Strolls with Pushkin took the prize as the selection of the jury, in a tie broken by the decision of the head of the jury. However, the choice of experts, they're merely identified as experty, was Benedikt Yerofiev's Moskva Petushki. The choice of those apparently rather few people in attendance at the event itself, which I believe was held in the Moscow Polytechnic Institute, was Shulamov's Kalima Tales. And the choice of internet voters was Vasil Iskander's Sandro from Chigem.
Now, our next speaker is Piotr Henryk Kosicky, and he is a Centennial Fellow and ABD in the Department of History at Princeton University, and a lecturer at the Institut d'études politiques de Paris. Kosicky has published academic articles and book chapters in 5 languages, and he is currently finishing a PhD dissertation entitled Catholic, Socialist, European, Intellectual, Political, and Religious Exchange between Poland and Europe, 1905-1980. What a scope. Kosicky is also co-editor of the forthcoming volume, The Global, 1989, International and Transnational Connections in a revolutionary world. And his presentation is twofold. He will present some comments of Justyna Beinek, and then he comment on her comments.
Thank you very much to Marco for the kind invitation. I beg your indulgence in advance because this is a fairly non-standard presentation, certainly the first time I've done something like this, which is that I got a phone call at 10 p.m. yesterday from Justyna Beinek, who fell ill and was unable to come. And this morning she emailed me sketches for her presentation. So I have the task of basically giving you a two-for-one deal today, which is to offer her presentation in rapid, as to the extent that I can, and then to sort of riff in another direction on the same theme. Her presentation, or such as it is for the moment, is dealing with the impact of nonconformism and dissent in film in Poland since 1989, and I will take that as a point of departure for some comments on the history, the cultural significance of the history of commemoration of Katyń in Poland, particularly in reference to Andrzej Wajda's film. The answer to the very interesting question posed by this conference, is there a lasting and currently relevant legacy to the culture of nonconformism and dissent that flourished in Poland during the last 2 decades of the communist rule? Very much depends on whether we focus on the former, more general, or latter, more spatiotemporally specific part of the question. As long as we remain in the sphere of the idea of dissent and counterculture, we can clearly see that such discursive spaces exist today, even if we limit ourselves to consider only one space of culture, film. Just as they did 25 years ago, even if they have been around different issues. Today those issues are, for example, women, LGBT community rights, to be even more specific, quotas that would guarantee women's political representation, the debate over in vitro fertilization, legalization of gay marriages, environmental issues including resource management, urban planning, etc., as opposed to the concerns of the 1970s and 1980s, which included, for example, freedom of expression, workers' rights, and workers' unions, or low pay versus rising prices of basic foodstuffs. The difficulty in tracing the link between the forms of dissent practiced by Poland's opposition and counterculture in the 1970s and 1980s, and those practiced today, lies in the fact that not only both the foci of interest and the forms have drastically changed. Forms have changed in response to the degree of granted freedoms, in press, for instance, but also in response to changing technologies that allow for computer-assisted dissent, for example, YouTube, among other things, social networks constructed online, but also in that today's dissenters do not necessarily inscribe themselves in the great tradition of the Committee of the Defense for Workers and Solidarity. There is perhaps very little living memory, in fact, of dissent of the 2 pre-1989 decades, or very little or no interest in positioning oneself, particularly among younger generations, as a direct beneficiary of the tradition that was able to dismantle an empire, change the whole world's balance of power, and affect the lives of millions of people. To sum up, the ideas of nonconformism and dissent seem to be permanently inscribed, tattooed, if you will, on Polish culture, going back at least into the 19th century romantic messianic ideologies, which translated the forging of national identity into seeking ways of attaining political independence and into promoting a clandestine model of culture that would make the national project possible, encouraging underground activities, defying authorities, inventing or perfecting various forms of explicit and implicit protest, e.g. through religious or literary practices, etc. However, if we talk about the more historically specific tradition of dissent, such as the Polish opposition of the 1970s and 1980s, that led to the creation of Solidarity in August of 1980, which served as a social and political platform for counteracting the effects of martial law in the early 1980s and orchestrated the fall of communism in 1989, the question of guiding legacy or passing memory becomes more complex. It becomes even more complex if we narrow down our field of vision to literature, culture, and the arts, i.e. the contemporary aesthetic representations of ideas of dissent or opposition as developed by Polish dissidents between 1970 and 1989, approximately. Now, this was intended to be one of 2 substantive sections of Justyna's presentation, and it is somewhat incomplete. So the way that I'm going to frame just to introduce the fragment that I'm reading is with the emphasis was originally supposed to combine literature, aesthetic sculptural representations, and film. And in the end, there will be a couple of references to the other media, but the focus in the comments that I'm going to read is on film. If there's anyone here who might wonder why pigs, nails, and Lego blocks, all of these in quotation marks, are brought up at this point, let me briefly explain that these are three canonical, in the sense of belonging to the canon of transgression, products of post-communist Polish culture. Pigs being the title, in translation, of Władysław Pasikowski's cult movie entitled Pigs, the original Polish being Psy, produced in 1991 and dubbed Poland's first blockbuster film. Nails, i.e. Andrzej Nails Robakowski, being the drug-dealing narrator and protagonist of Dorota Masłowska's 2002 novel Snow White, Russian Red, in the Polish original Wojna polsko-ruska pod flagą biało-czerwoną, described by critics as iconoclastic, provocative, and almost blasphemous. And finally, Lego blocks, being the primary material used in the so-called Lego concentration camp set, an equally heretical conceptual work of art designed by Zbigniew Libera in 1996. What these and other projects of this kind have in common is that they constitute, quote, art of insult, end quote, to use Alan Cooperman's apt term from a Washington Post article discussing Libera's conceptual art. The question is, of course, what or who is being insulted? Most likely it is the Romantic paradigm, to use Polish literary critic Maria Janion's term for Polish culture's romance with a, quote, unified romantic symbolic style of culture, end quote, fueled by the Romantic period with its Polish flavor. Messianism, Poland seen as a Christ of nations, tropes of Matka Polka, Polish mother, Matka Polska, Mother Poland, to mention just a few phenomena. According to this paradigm, the Romantic age did not really end until 1989. And while it lasted, as Janion argued, it served a compensatory therapeutic function for the nation. As Elżbieta Matynia writes, quote, this all-embracing paradigm designated a very clear role for art and the artist throughout most of the past 2 centuries. Polish art was expected and conditioned to perform service on behalf of the captive nation, end quote. Matynia proposes to call this state of affairs a salvational culturalism, after Arjuna Padurai, the sole role of which is to mobilize culture in the service of Polish national politics. As the key elements of the culturalist syndrome, she sees recounting of heroic past as a prime builder of national consciousness. The idea of a tortured nation, heavily gendered, and in the absence of a satisfying reality, a life within symbols and allegories, community of the spirit, the absence of a satisfying reality. Any effort to challenge Polish culturalism has been and still is a controversial, if not indeed sacrilegious, undertaking. Efforts to contest the legitimizing power of time have been consistently defeated because they competed with a key priority, the project of national sovereignty. The pervasiveness of spiritual suffering, mixed with messianic fervor and popular religiosity, were all products of the Romantic outlook. In a bold move to expose this culturalism spent force, made irrelevant after reaching the ultimate liberation in 1989, literature, film, and art initiated a shift from the symbolic spiritual realm to the physical sensual emphasis, from the intuitive passionate to the rational discursive. This move away from a romantic fixation on the soul brought about various transgressions. Artists proposed new explorations of history, particularly Zbigniew Libera, of patriotism and Poland's entrapment between East and West, but also explorations of the body within its physiology, of polluting successful cultural models such as Polish cinema of moral concern from the 1970s and 80s, of which Wajda's Man of Marble is a prime example, as are films by Agnieszka Holland, Krzysztof Kieślowski, or Krzysztof Zanussi, with new Polish films with American accents, such as Gender Destabilization and Construction. Transgressive art objects, of which I gave only brief examples, expand, may we say, the shrinking public sphere, which is, as Jürgen Habermas stated, a sphere of criticism of public authority created by private agents, i.e. civil society. The works I mentioned here challenge the core traditions of artistic representations, such, perhaps, but even more so, they question the Polish artistic canon for its devotion to the national community. They question the easy marketability of patriotism as a commodity, and also question the role of the writer, filmmaker, artist, who has been seen as a spiritual leader, providing a needed sense of group identity and solidarity within the Romantic paradigm. The new artists create spaces of dissent. Art becomes a realm in which democracy is being tested. Art has become a strategy for expanding dimensions of democracy, for pluralizing the public sphere in order to engender citizens' deliberations and negotiate differences. This transgressive art, while often jarring and uncomfortable to read, watch, or process otherwise, allows for periodical revivals of the discursive aspect of civil society and a broadening of its public spheres. My students can attest to how uncomfortable the transgressive work can be by saying about the film Pigs, it's not a good film, but it's very interesting. In that sense, transgressive novels, films, and installations serve as props in the process of civil disobedience. 1989 was an obvious caesura in the development of Polish cinema. Marek Haltow called the situation after 1989 landscape after battle. In the summer of 1989, a peaceful transition democracy was made following June 1st free elections and the formation of the first free government headed by Tadeusz Mazowiecki. 89 was likewise a turning point for the Polish film industry. Once again, it was not a cinematic movement, but a political transformation that defined a new period. The nationalized and centralized film industry, entirely dependent on government funding, was transformed into a free market economy subsidized by the state. Filmmakers were relieved of their traditional duties as a conscience of nation, liberated from political commitments. The political role commonly reserved for artists has returned to politicians, and filmmaking has become a professionalized endeavor. After 1989, many films that were shelved by censorship were released, including Krzysztof Kieślowski's Blind Chance, Agnieszka Holland's A Lonely Woman, Bugajski's Interrogation. The move toward market economy coincided with the universalization of co-productions in Europe and the incorporation of American popular cinema into the market. The end of communism and the emergence of a new audience have brought some inevitable changes to film production and distribution, as well as to film thematics and stylistics. Co-productions, multinational enterprises, connections with Hollywood, a plurality of styles and genres have been changing the film landscape in Poland. After 1989, there were claims, supported by Wajda, Zanussi, and Holland, that the Polish cinema was in danger of extreme commercialization. Some filmmakers went as far as to say that state censorship ensured artistic originality. Kieślowski remarked that filmmakers were in Poland in a, quote, luxurious and unique situation. We were truly important precisely because of censorship. Now we're allowed to say everything, but people stopped caring what we are allowed to say. And this is where the passage that I have from the intended speaker for today stops. I'm going to grab some water. Thanks. And if you'll permit me a brief coda of my own. The connection that I thought useful to make when I was just, in my brief reflections that I've had the opportunity to put together on the topic of the conference, it seems to me that the notion of a guiding legacy or passing memory forces certain questions to be asked in terms of what specific notion of culture is being deployed. Now, I don't really specialize in literary analysis or in aesthetic analysis as such, but I have had a secondary or even tertiary interest for some years in the commemorative movements of the Katyn massacres of 1940. And I couldn't help but notice when I was in Poland for the release of Andrzej Wajda's film Katyn in 2007 that the event itself opened a media storm, opened a storm of public discourse. All of the elements that Justyna describes as being problematized once again in the context of a post-1989 public sphere come into play with the film Katyn in 2007. And 4 years later now, we can also see a much deeper problematization of the issues opened by the film in the context of the plane crash, the presidential plane crash last year, which opens up the issue of whether or not there is a Katyn number 2. So the Katyn public debates generated in Poland combine to a certain extent a mediatized version of the 1940 massacres with this politicized, also mediatized, but in a completely different fashion, symbolic notion of a Katyn number 2, emblematized in part by a cross planted in front of the presidential palace, initially as a symbol of mourning, and subsequently devolved into a confrontation between certain fringe groups, both secular and religious. I don't really have an opportunity to launch into any kind of even remotely full-throated analysis of the issues. But one thing that I did want to underscore is that we're talking about legacy and memory, a notion that I've associated with this sort of debate, having attended several conferences and having organized one myself on the collapse of communism several years ago, is the notion of ghosts. If you're familiar with Alexander Etkin's work on Russian literature, post-transition, post-transformation, ghosts and demons and spirits and phantasms, inhabiting and personifying unprocessed, unworked through in the Benjaminian sense, elements of transition from communism to post-communism. And this is something that I think is interesting to throw into the discussion also of the Katyn film. Now again, forgive me please for not being able to go into more detailed analysis, but I will raise the point that Andrzej Wajda is an element of what has been called post-memory, in the sense that he is the son of a victim of one of the massacres that are collectively grouped into the Katyn massacres. He's the son of a victim who died at Kharkiv at the hands of the NKVD in the spring of 1940. And if you look at his public statements upon the release of the film, or in the debates, particularly, let's say, following the Smolensk plane crash, there's a deep personal connection that embodies, I think, a lot of elements that it would be hard to chalk up to the type of discussion of culture that we've been having so far in this session today, but I think are nonetheless worthy of emphasis, which is a more problematic boundary between popular and elite culture. In other words, the victims destined for killing by the NKVD in the Katyn massacres were designated as such because they were personified as elites, the bourgeois counter-revolutionary elites. And yet there has been trouble, significant trouble, since 1989 in Poland with establishing the line and establishing an audience for popular representations of histories of the Katyn massacres and commemorations of the Katyn massacres because of this line. To what extent is it possible for families of these ideologically designated elites who are bracketed in this group for the duration of the People's Republic of Poland, and to what extent can that be communicated to a broader public and be entrenched as a core element of national culture? And certainly the Wajda film and certainly the presidential plane crash last year have changed the valence of those debates. But if you examine more closely the history of commemoration practices of Katyn itself, which involves a history dating back into sub-rosa conversations in the late 1940s and throughout the 1950s among family members, post-1956, actual small-scale commemorative ceremonies held first, for example, in 1959 at the Powązki Military Cemetery in Warsaw. Very interesting documentation in the State Security Archives in Poland on this, for example, just initially talking about lunatics from older generations who are going and needn't be troubled because their activities are not politically relevant, then emerging over the course of the next 2 decades into a deeply, deeply salient element of the clandestine activities. So the Catharine Institute or the Catharine Committee created in the late 1970s that were subsumed into the Solidarity movement in 1980-81. This is all reflective of what's curious, a major movement that had a lot of trouble creating mainstream visibility for itself as a movement independently of any political messages until Wajda's film came onto the picture. I don't want to go on because I think I'm already over time for the collective reflections of Justyna and myself. And I don't want to suggest that I, by any stretch of the imagination, can cover all of her material in Q&A, but hopefully it would be possible to reflect a little bit more on the general arguments and some of the specifics as well. Thank you very much. I hope.
Thank you very much for this heroic presentation. We will start questions and answers, hopefully. And the microphone is there.
Since Kathy addressed a question that I raised in my talk yesterday, I trust that I have time to say a few words to respond and not just asking a question. Thank you for raising the question of the term dissidents and the concept dissidents and what we understand by it. I also want to mention that before the conference, I asked the organizers of the conference to change at least the title of my panel into dissidents, a history, instead of nonconformists and dissidents, precisely because I knew that what we will discuss, the three speakers that would be presenting papers, would be talking about dissidents. Both Jerry Leiber and I have been involved for decades in Amnesty International, and in Amnesty International, the concept of a dissident was an individual who had certain beliefs and was ready to risk his career and even life in order to defend these beliefs. It was not just someone who would say no. And when I say that it would be a trivialization of what the dissidents were, I was afraid that the discussion would deteriorate into what it has deteriorated today. Well, saying no in a bedroom. Yes, you could say no in a bedroom, but there's a difference if you know that your partner is a savage brute who will strangle you, and someone who is a pussycat, and you just, well, you don't feel like it. And if you say no to the brute, you hold certain ideals. And this is what is meant by dissidents. As far as the nonconformists are concerned, I would say that you have answered my question at the end of your talk when you said that Andryczyk knew that he would be arrested and that perhaps he would not survive the labor camps. And he was arrested, and here I would beg to disagree, for his political views, because the quote that Jerry Leiber familiarized or reminded us of yesterday was definitely, had definitely a political content. And so that is the main difference. He was dangerous to the Soviet system because of some of his political views. And I made that comparison to Frajlich-Zajac, whose beautiful paintings we will be seeing today, and many of us will, at the concert. He was arrested not because he did not conform to socialist realism. He was arrested because he defended the right of certain individuals who were arrested by the Soviet regime. That was the reason for Zajac's imprisonment. Okay. Now, from that, as far as Sinialski and Daniel are concerned, their works did have political content that was inconvenient for the Soviet regime. But we can debate it later. As far as nonconformism is concerned, I want to mention that as far as the Ukrainian dissidents, at the very start, the literary figure, in particular Frajlich, his poetry does not contain political ideas. His poetry and that of his colleagues, Lena Kostenko and others, was dangerous because it was authentically Ukrainian, precisely like the individuals that you mentioned with respect to the nonconformists of the 70s and 80s. If these nonconformists went underground, it's because, well, they knew very well what happened to their predecessors. And if they survived, it is because the Soviet Union fell apart. So I better go before I'm forced to do so.
Right.
Sinialski was responding very explicitly, and I had the opportunity to talk to him about this over the years. He was political only in the sense that he wanted to respond to the Soviet states position that anything was political, and by reclaiming a sphere for something that wasn't political. But if you accept that that was a political act, you are accepting precisely the terms that the Soviet government was imposing upon culture. That's all I would say.
Thank you. Do you want?
Yeah. I'll also respond briefly to, I guess, what were two questions to me at the end. I don't think there's any doubt that the circles that I talked about would exclude Lena Kostenko from authentic Ukrainian culture or from or Svitlichny for that matter. And so, yes, that's part of the connection made going back through the 20s. And I mentioned that would be one of the reasons why you would go underground, was because of what they witnessed happening to their predecessors.
First, a question to Mr. Kosicky to address, it is a little hard, the remarks of Justyna, particularly on the Romanticism issue and Polish culture before 1989. I know this is a commonplace of this Romantic tradition, yet in reality I wonder, sort of national obligation and other things I can see in this, but is this really all as related to a Polish Romantic tradition as many would affirm? Then on sensibilities, one of the things that I wish we had, yesterday I said I wish we had Lithuania, today I wish we had the Czech Republic. That is, we could have addressed Czech culture, which I think would have been essential for when we talk about how now people after 1989-91 relate to the culture. This, as far as I can see, probably the easiest connection is with much of the Czech writing. And maybe address that, how that relates in comparison to Polish. Then on the question of censorship, I always think one of the greatest gifts the Soviets gave to Polish culture is they stopped the filming of Ogniem Mieczem. Because then when, of course, you could think that this great film would come, and then, of course, somebody had to create the film, and then the film became a politically correct cowboys and Indians film that really, so as a film that was not filmed, it could be a great film in Polish tradition. As soon as you filmed it, you were stuck with it. But this relates to the censorship issue that everyone faced, and this is my more general question to all, and hard, I know, to give an evaluation. In evaluating the culture of this 1960s to 80s and what remains, we all know how we react. We don't all, because some are very young here, but many of us reacted to this as it came out in a specific context. Our evaluation of this culture was related to that context and the conditions under which people created. Simonenko as a poet, or the letter to the Kurds, these things that were so meaningful to us at that time. I wonder, in all three cases of the speakers now, I realize there's a very large topic, would say that if they were addressing their classes and saying, okay, this is really what still you would look at this period, and I can recommend to you, and it doesn't make any difference that you haven't got the faintest idea in what conditions this arose and what the conditions were. What do you think of it?
I think I can answer that question in the following manner. There was a recent publication edited by Bogomila Berdychowska, Bunt Pokolenia. It's a series of interviews with Шестидесятники and one Семидесятник. And in introduction, she refers to the legacy of the Шестидесятники, and I actually had it in, I think I have it quoted here, but maybe not. But in general, the idea was that it's more of a historical historical legacy than a cultural legacy, or I don't want to misquote her. I have it here somewhere, but she had it as part of that, and I think that is what I feel about it too. That yes, I would teach it to my students, of course, but out of context, it may not have the same resonance and may not have the same influence as other works from the period, but quite important, of course. Yeah, I can't find the.
Should we go in order? Siniavsky has a great line. Sorry to, well, actually, since he's the subject of my paper, I guess I shouldn't be sorry to keep bringing him up. But in his story, Grafomani, there's a great line where someone says censorship was the best friend of the Russian writer because, if you were some British lord who thought you had great talent as a poet, you could go out and publish your poetry, and then it would get panned by the critic, and you go on and do something useful with your life. But in Russia, you could just claim that you were this great, unpublished writer, and so that's the title. Graphomaniacs of the story should give you an idea of where he was going. But I guess I was too subtle in implying that what I thought was really telling about the results of this competition, which admittedly it's very self-selective. When we're talking about Irina Prokhorov's group, this is the elite of the elite of intellectuals in Russia today. But these are exactly the people I teach. I mean, in other words, these are, even the Kalinitas are quite brilliant literary works. I mean, even though they're, camp works, Moskva to the End of the Line, Strolls with Pushkin, the most non-camp-like of all the works, that there seems to be, it seems to be on the, it may be a little bit too optimistic to say this is a barometer, that they've recovered from valuing literary works precisely because, or just because they were brave. And that's not to say we shouldn't remember those works historically, but that they really picked. I mean, Iskander's Sandrovich from Shugem is a brilliant literary work. To be fair, so is the Gulag Archipelago. And someday when it recovers from being a prison camp, a labor camp memoir, and it's read for its amazing brilliance as a literary rendering of the camp experience, I think it may be back up there on the list.
Do you have any to that concern? Do you have any comment to a concern?
Well, I think there were several questions specifically addressed to Justyna, right? So I will be Justyna for a moment. My sense, now obviously this is only a fragmentary analysis, and I think I'm afraid that ultimately we don't really get Justyna's own analysis in here, because the point of departure is that examples from the aesthetic fields, such as Masłowska's writing, such as Pasikovsky's filmmaking, addressed the standard perception, which is also what the object of your objection is, I think, right? So, I obviously agree that there's far more than just a national martyrology, and I think Justyna would as well. So I think also if you go, I don't want to make Maria Janjon and Elżbieta Matynia and these other sort of analysts come out, I don't want to make them sound like, I don't want to reduce them to sort of a broad sense of longue durée nationalism and messianism, because I don't think that's quite their point either. I mean, my sense is the point here is that the aura that is defined by the reaction immediately post-1989, as all of these analysts perceive it, is the aura of romanticism as it existed before. So it's a return to whatever was before communism. In some cases, it's a return to before 1918 in particular. I mean, I don't want to go into too much detail because it isn't really my field, but I mean, I could give you several examples off the top of my head from the communist period, depending how you define, obviously, cultural and intellectual activity that show that there's far more going on. But that is your point as well. So yes, I mean, I think the point is well taken. I think Justyna would say the same. In terms of censorship, well, the Czech culture issue, I didn't quite get from your question. Did you think that Czech culture would be a point of contrast or a point of confluence?
My assumption is that Czech writing holds up better.
Okay.
It certainly seems to hold up better to my students when I use it than much of what's available, of course, in Polish literature and translation.
Sure.
But I wonder if that as well is true. That is, the sensibility of Czechs today, is that closer to the Czech writing of that period? Of course, some of that writing is also
My cursory impressionistic answer would be yes, although I think that, I mean, the essence, if we're going again from Justyna's framework to answer your question, it's less about the literature itself than about the canons that have been defined since 1989 to capture what was going on immediately before 1989, which unfortunately I don't know well enough to be able to answer the question.
And I, of course, don't know film well enough to, but film would seem to be in other cases.
Sorry.
Bill Risch, Georgia College. Two general questions to all three. I mean, Piotr, if you'd like to answer, that's fine too. I didn't know if you wanted to. But this question about cultural authenticity, what is authentic? That's a question that just, I'd like to hear your responses to that. What constitutes cultural authenticity? And second, this regards art and aesthetics, and that is, when does the violation of literary and artistic form become political? Because that does have implications, I think, definitely for the late Soviet period for both of our presenters today.
I'm not sure I understand how you, the first question, because I can think of a number of different ways of answering it, but I suspect they're not what you're asking. Okay, then you do that, yes. I mean, I would only throw out there that the first thing that came into my head was that in the preface, The Gulag Archipelago, Solzhenitsyn claims absolute authenticity for his work of literature because he has carried out the experience upon which it is based on the marks on his body that were left by the camp. You know, so that's a kind of, but I'm not sure that that's what you meant. Okay, the second question, now remind me what the second question was, because I did have something to say about that.
The literary and artistic form.
Oh, yeah. I think that in the Soviet period, that was a major issue, and this is one of the topics that I think is a happening topic right now. That as we get some distance from the period, we find that that old chestnut that people got shot for in the 1930s, that you were a formalist, was more than just an empty political slogan. That conforming to rules about how you presented art across the spectrum of the arts was the key. The key characteristic of socialist realism. What I tend to say to my students is that, for instance, you can draw a lot of similarities between Norman Rockwell and socialist realism, and in fact, there's some evidence that socialist realism was influenced by Norman Rockwell. But if you like Norman Rockwell, you could buy Jackson Pollock. You had a lot of choice. In the Soviet Union, that wasn't true. There was one acceptable style. And so it was the conformity of style. And so when you start getting into the post-Stalin period, it really was the avant-garde artists, just as perhaps in the 20s, that were more threatening. And this is why I don't think Sinyavsky was ever playing games about saying he had stylistic disagreements, that really was... there really isn't anything terribly politically questionable about his works. It was the way they were written, and other writers of the period that really got into trouble. On the other hand, why was Putin so eager, not just Putin, but Yeltsin, so eager to welcome Solzhenitsyn back? Because in some ways, the form of his works, the way he wrote, the basic understanding of the relationship between language and literature that Solzhenitsyn accepted was identical to socialist realism. And again, I wrote a good part of my doctoral dissertation and my master's thesis on Solzhenitsyn. So as much as I'm taking a certain stance here, I don't want to suggest that I don't think he was a talented writer. But he was more palatable than remember, One Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich got published. None of the Terz works did.
Yeah.
So can I ask that? Oh, I'm sorry.
Just briefly, to
sure,
answer.
sure,
I agree
I'm
with Kathy said, and it's not about really the rules so much. It's about there's only being one set of rules. I mean, one of 20th century's greatest Ukrainian poets, Mykola Zadov, wrote in a form that was all about, writing the perfect sonnet, and it was all about keeping to the rules, and can you do the perfect things? So it wasn't about that. It's just about being one set of rules. And the linking, I mean, this is a term I use, so it's fair that I answer that. This authentic culture, I see it as a linking to previous cultural achievements that had been banned or suppressed, and this need to connect this to counter what was being presented as, the Soviet Ukrainian culture. So in this sense, it's authentic. Yes, this is Ukrainian culture. This is what this the tradition we come from. These are our influences. We are part of this. There is a linking to this. And that's what I meant by that term, Bill, if that's helpful. Yeah.
Necessarily voicing a desire to return to past situations or a nostalgia for communism, but rather an overwhelming fear of and anxiety for what changes the future will inevitably bring. And this is as a question: is there the fear exists in the present production, literary production? No. Wrong question.
Well, I'm willing to take this on because I think again, it was something I was trying to suggest at the end. And something in an earlier version, before Siniavsky won this prize, I had a different paper. That it's one thing to talk about nonconformism in a society. I think my opening line was, we can argue about whether the Soviet Union was totalitarian or not, but we can't really argue about whether it was conformist or not. I mean, it was unquestionably a society that demanded an incredible degree of conformism, and it's much easier to figure out who a nonconformist is or who's breaking the rules when the rules are really clear. What happens 20 years later when we have a full-blown market economy entertainment culture? We could even argue that one of the most understudied aspects of what's happening in Russia today is the extent to which entertainment culture, of the sort that fascist societies like because it distracts from culture, from politics, and it distracts people from looking at politics, is being encouraged in the Soviet Union. And that writers, the traditional role of the Russian writer as being a spokesperson for society or being a moral voice has been very much sidetracked. And that, in fact, again, to come back to what this competition might suggest is that a certain part of the avant-garde is accepting this as the normal place of the writer in the society. The normal place of the writer, of the great writer or the elite writer is to not write for a mass audience, to not change politics, to just write. And not to compete with detective novels, or not to compete with Wheel of Fortune, or that it's okay for all of that to exist, but that it's very different from the role that was thrust upon the writer during the Soviet period.
To Marco Pavlishin.
I'm not as good as playing two roles tonight, especially not from Australia.
I would be happy to see Marco Pavlishin also here on this conference. So, Andryczyk. As I understood, you mentioned in your paper at least two generations, generation of 70s and generation of 80s. The first one is associated with underground literature, and generation of 80s with post-Soviet literature. So my question is, could you describe a situation of this generation of 70s underground literature after the collapse of the Soviet Union? Because people from this two generation and the youngest generation, as for example, generation of 90s and also so-called dvotысячники, they coexist in contemporary literature. So how could you differentiate between this generation, and does it make sense today or not?
You hate to use these terms, these grouping terms, but sometimes it just makes it easier for presentations to lump. And there are writers that, of course, straddle several generations in terms. It's always funny when you see anthologies that begin with Lachelle and end with Zhadan, and this is considered one generation. So it's always problematic. But I think what we can say is that in post-Soviet, from the 1990s on, it wasn't only about being introduced to the underground culture of the 70s and the 80s, but also, the 20s and all sorts of translations now being accessible. So that's why it was such an exciting period. So there was a coexistence of various things, not just this generation. But my argument today was that this 70s generation was very influential on providing a means of existence and production with survival kind of as an artist in the situation that would come in post-Soviet times. But so then, you have subsequent generations that are all a part of this process now, but that's where the break is more important, I believe. And just going back to, this kind of links with the answer to that, was that the fear of losing, the fear of the new, this was exactly what Ukrainian literature needed in the 90s, and that's why it was so vibrant. There was various styles, so there was no fear, there was euphoria.
It was not stifling, it was
No, not at all.
inspiring. I understand that Catherine has one question, and then you.
It's often, in terms of legacies of dissent, it's been said about specifically Russian literature or Russian nonconformists, sorry, Anna, of the 1960s that after Dr. Zhivago, in the last part of the novel, Dr. Zhivago, when Yuri Zhivago drops out of Soviet society because there's no place for him as a role model. And so deliberately intellectual figures would take jobs as dvorniki, or as janitors, because that way they would not be forced to compromise their principles, but also they actually identified this as being the influence specifically of Pasternak's novels. So I don't know if you've seen anything of that. And then I'm going to take this opportunity, I'm not sure this is kind of a question, but since we're talking about legacies, you brought up the commemorations of Catherine, and I'm really interested in commemorations, but...
Louder,
Oh, I'm sorry. I don't usually, people usually tell me to shut up. I mean, I'm sorry. I don't know what's going on today. But what it made me also think of, because Catherine raises really difficult issues about art as a means of commemoration. I don't know if you want to say something about that. And I was going to kind of leech onto that and say that one other way that dissident works are coming back today in Russia is there's this incredible boom in, made largely for film, but often made for television, serials of Russian classic novels. But what's interesting is it's everything from Dostoevsky's The Idiot to some of you will know the very controversial Gogol, Taras Bulba, which Yuri Shevchuk has shown here with, to good effect in terms of Russian-Ukrainian dialogue. But Polish, yes, because Polish especially. But also the fact that right up there with works by Gogol and Tolstoy are works by all the dissident writers that are being made for Bulgakov's Master and Margarita, all sorts of Solzhenitsyn. And it's interesting that, again, they're being accepted as classics now that are being reabsorbed into Russian culture. Anyway.
Just briefly on the second one, it's interesting because Ukrainian television is showing the same films of Russian classics all the time. I can get Bulgakov and Gogol, but so the Ukrainian is less present on Ukrainian TV there. As far as to Dr. Zhivago, I can't answer. Maybe the next panel can say that, but as far as jobs working, as porters or something, I think it was, you had to have a job in the Soviet Union. You were thrown out of the higher education system, and it often offered a certain sense of freedom to create. You weren't really tied down to a certain job. So I think maybe that would be why that would be attractive. It's hard to call it attractive, but that was undertaken. But maybe we'll ask them that.
If I can just quickly, I guess, I think that Catherine is a special case for a number of reasons. I mean, if we look at Vaida's own career, it's interesting, that essentially his entire film career is defined by commemorative art pieces, right? I mean, one of his first major pieces is Kanał, and Kanał is a commemoration of World War II. It's a form of World War II memory, and 50-some years later, we get another form with the obvious difference in political valence. So I don't know if it's possible.
Microphone.
I don't know if it's possible to extrapolate too much, although I do think it's interesting that particularly when you compare the film medium to the literary medium and even the theatrical medium in Poland in terms of representations. I mean, I hate to fixate on World War II, but that is sort of where it's the focal point of the commemorative action since 1989. Just as one example, Jan Tomasz Gross's Neighbors has produced a number of works. The Nike Prize last year went to a book, the name is, Nasza Klasa, right? So Our Class, which is a theatrical piece based on playing out the fact pattern for the Jedwabne massacre. So there's almost a direct correlation between debates that take place on the boundaries of academic and public media discussion, and then the art that takes those as a springboard for creating new valences of memory. It's very interesting, and you can see in Poland, particularly over the past decade, this real back and forth and give and take between the two different realms.
My question principally, I think, would be to Catherine Nepomnyashchy, as she mentioned stylistic difference of Sieniawski. And I'm Victor Balashov, former dissident, and I would say linguist by background. And that's why my question to Catherine Nepomnyashchy about Sieniawski in context of his stylistic disagreement with the government or whatever. And maybe I would like to clarify it in a way from linguistic perspective as a dissident. I would say the language per se was abused to the point like even Solzhenitsyn wrote «Жить не положи». So it's much more universal disagreement, and coming again what is nonconformist, what are dissidents are. In Russian language there is свобода слова, свобода мысли, свобода мыслящие. So in reality we knew what the names we call, like political prisoner, политзека. Everybody was политзека, not dissident. So there is a disagreement in translation. Even prison of consciousness in Russia sounds in translation, узник совести, it's almost pseudo-religious, but if in reality, if you translate it, it's a prisoner of cognition, prisoner of intelligence or whatever. So that's why I don't know how to I would say that this agreement that happens on the title, and Anya mentioned, would it be nonconformist, whatever. There is words like independent, thinking independent, writing independent, art. In Russian, it's независимый, or независимость, again, independence. There is, I would say, it's disagreement or cognitive dissonance that definitely should be addressed, and to make it clear, but anyone who practiced dissent in Russia as a political prisoner, we know what we mean when we go for trial, and Sieniawski knew when he mentioned, you are correct, that he was stylistic different, with that. The same, I would say, even with Solzhenitsyn, regardless of his conformism and going with KGB new, elite, and accepting them just because of his religious belief, essentially. And he, agrees now with the system of thinking which I, for myself, disagree in reference to your question about church in the yesterday's panel, which is different issue, and it might be addressed in the art panel. But my question to you, Katy, really, how you would, balance that, the words «независимая мысль» или «свобода мыслящий», or whatever, it's not a dissident, really. No one, including Pavel Litvinovich, wasn't happy with this word, regardless that he made career on this, dissident wording and relations with the West.
Victor, I'm going to give you a copy of my book, which I actually brought with. It's a really big question. And to be honest, I don't want to get hung up over terminology because I don't have any strong feelings personally. I agree with you. We know who was who. And who stepped over the line, and I do agree with Anna. There was a line people stepped over, and once you stepped over that line, whatever you called that person, whether they were a dissident or a prisoner of conscience, there was a line. And it's been well documented in memoirs and people's life stories that there was a point past which you knew that you were you had parted company with being an official Soviet citizen, and you were, in some sense, for lack of a better term, a dissident. I guess what I'm trying to talk about, the best way I can think of in some short way talking about this would be to refer to the very end of a book. I'm going to ask a question, and nobody has to answer that. Has anybody in this audience read Andrei Sinyavsky's Tini Gogolia? Yes. Okay, so there are people who have read it. I mean, which is one of the great unappreciated works of Russian literature. And it ends when he talks about the model of the Skomaruch. The Skomaruchi who were engaged in divine play, and who in some sense liberated thought and also represented for him a meeting of spirituality and play that was in some sense profoundly liberating. To my mind, that was his model throughout his career for the way he wrote. It wasn't about having a political program. It was about being free to play in a very, for him was a deeply religious sense, and that's one of the things that has not been appreciated about Sinyavsky, and including by his wife, I must say. In any case, I think I need to stop at this point. I mean, this is.
I have to wear the other hat and organize things.
Yes.
Marco, you want to say something?
No, I just said I have to go organize things.
We prolonged a little bit, but we started later, so I think we are justified in. Thank you very much. Thank you very much to panelists. Thank you very much to guests, and that was really, I think, very great contribution. Thank you.
Thank you.